The backdrop here is the era right after the Churban, right after the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash. And it must be understood that in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, most particularly in the time of the first Beis HaMikdash, but even after in the time of the second Beis HaMikdash, after the time of the second Beis HaMikdash, it must be understood that the Jewish leadership, the hierarchy, if you like, of Jewish leadership, of how we are led, was very different to the time of the Beis HaMikdash. If you want, there's a very interesting acronym, a simon, that you can take down or remember. The word Mishkan, like the Mishkan, the tabernacle. Mishkan stands for Melech. Melech is a king. Shin is a shofet, the judge. Kof is the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. And Nun is the Novi, the prophet. So if you look in the Chumash, it's actually very interesting. It's in Parshas Shoftim, in the portion of Shoftim, right in the book of Devarim. So there's actually description, that's the Parsha of Jewish leadership. You have there the description of, not so much the Kohen Gadol. The Kohen Gadol is described in other places in Vayikra, extensively Parshas Emor. However, in the Parsha of Shoftim, you have 3 or 4 of those leaders. You have the description of the king, the Melech, the Novi, the prophet, and the Shofet, and the judge. Now we must remember that with let's say the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash, obviously the time of the Talmud Bavli is the second Beis HaMikdash, after the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash, but I just want to go back to the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash, because that would be most readily understood. Before the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash, before the Babylonian conquest of Eretz Yisroel, the exile of the important Jews to Bovel, to Babylon, the leadership was, we possessed all of those realms of leadership. We had a Melech, we had a king. In other words, we had a kingdom, a sovereign state. That was the Melech. Now the Melech, the king, was not necessarily righteous all the time, not necessarily a great tzaddik, quite often not, including in the time of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. But nevertheless, we had that. You had Shofet, the judge, in the form of the Sanhedrin. Now this is a very important thing. The Sanhedrin continued right through the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash, the Golus of Bovel, the rebuilding of the second Beis HaMikdash. The Sanhedrin continued until about 2 centuries after the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash. Meaning, if you many people's minds work with the Common Era, so you're talking about at least till the 3rd century, till the 3rd century Common Era, there was the Sanhedrin. And that's the Shofet, that's the judge. Now, then you have the Kohen Gadol, obviously, the Kohanim. The Kohen Gadol is a position of ruchnistic leadership, of spiritual, of holiness. And then you had the Novi, then you had the prophet. Now, with the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash, we lost any remnant of what we had of those leaders. Now, what did we have? We didn't have a king, but we had some form of sovereign state. That was lost at the time of the second Beis HaMikdash. We had the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin did carry on. That's important. We'll get back to that. The Kohen Gadol, we lost that. and then the Novi prophecy actually ended in the beginning of the second Beis Hamikdash. The last of the Nevi'im, the last of the prophets, Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi, lived at the beginning of the second Beis Hamikdash. And after that, we do not have Nevi'im, we have Ruach HaKodesh, different form of inspiration from Hashem, but nevertheless no Novi. Now, what takes over? What kind of Jewish leadership do we have in the time of Golus? Okay, so now we have leaders of a different kind. These are the ones we are familiar with. Most primarily, you have the Rosh Yeshiva. The Rosh Yeshiva, that's a form of Jewish leadership. You have a Rav, or what we call a Moiret Tzedek, somebody who meets out halachic rulings. A Rosh Yeshiva is not necessarily, doesn't necessarily function with the function of meeting out halacha l'maisa, halachic rulings in act for practicality. It's more academic many times not. We have the tzaddik, the Rebbe, whichever, we have our Rebbe, then we have, obviously, in every generation, Baal Shem Tov, tzaddikim, great tzaddikim. The interesting thing is that even in the time of the Golus, for much of the time of our 1900 plus years of Golus, there was also political Jewish leadership. Now, we're familiar with that today in Eretz Yisrael, there's political Jewish leaders. However, there was this position in Bovel called the Reish Golusa. Reish Golusa, I'm sure you've heard of this term. The Reish Golusa was a political leader of the Jewish people, of the Jewish exile, Golusa, Reish Golusa, the head of the exile. And he was a political leader. The Jews in Bovel, in Babylon, which is now Iraq, Iran, enjoyed semi-autonomy, and for centuries, they paid into the coffers of the ruling class, to the king, whoever he was, and the Jewish community had an sort of semi-autonomy of their own, and this was run by somebody called the Reish Golusa, the head of the exile. Now, he was a Jew who had, political prowess. He was savvy politically, ruled and had quite a bit of authority. He could put people in jail. He could fine people. He was pretty powerful. He could do what a governor today could do. So this is the shift. We have a different kind of leader, different kinds of people fulfilling their roles for the Jewish people in Golus. So who rises? Who comes on the scene after the Churban of the second Beis Hamikdash? Now we're in the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash, by the Romans, so the Roman era here. Who comes to the scene? So now we're talking in the 3rd century, if that's how many people's minds again work that way. So I'm just going to use that. So the 3rd century, we're now in the 21st century, so you can do the math. So in the 3rd century, you had Rabbi Yehuda Hanossi. Rabbi Yehuda Hanossi, one of the greatest tzaddikim, one of the greatest Jewish leaders who ever lived, the editor of the Mishnah, who was the leader, the undisputed leader, both spiritually and materially, in Eretz Yisroel, in Israel. And in his time, the Mishnah was edited, the Mishnah was sealed. That was the end of what we call the era of the Mishnah. After Rabbi Yehuda Hanossi's passing, 2 things happened. Now again, this is in the 3rd century. Number one, times for the Jewish community in Eretz Yisrael became very, very difficult. The Romans ruled with a with an iron fist. It depended who the emperor was, and it depended what was going on. We know Rabbi Yehuda Hanossi was on very good terms with the Roman emperor in his time. After he passed, things changed, and there was always there were always Jews. There was always a Jewish community. There was always Torah learning in Eretz Yisrael, but the real place to be, so to say, unfortunately, the real place that was booming as far as Torah learning and also material success was Bovel. That was the place to be. I'll say this now, but this is something you could keep in mind because this may come up. History repeats itself. This is the rule. And these days, there are basically 85% of Jews, of Yidden, find themselves either in the United States of America, if you exclude Canada, and in Eretz Yisrael. 85%, roughly. And so you have, and then in other countries you have, obviously very nice communities, but if there's two concentrations, and in a very large way, our time reflects this time. Where is the center of Judaism? Where are there more Jews? Where is the place to be as far as Torah learning is concerned? Okay, these are interesting questions, and they have answers. I think, especially it depends. I think they do have answers, but regardless, we do have two centers of Jewish people, one in Chutz La'aretz, one in the diaspora, and one in Eretz Yisrael. But definitely now it's in the 3rd century that the limelight moves to Bovel, moves to Babylon. That's number one. Number two, from a Torah perspective, after the Mishnah has ended, after what we call the Chasimas HaMishnah, the sealing of the Mishnah, we end the time of the Tanoim, the time which we call the sages, those sages, those tzaddikim who contributed to the Mishnah are called Tanoim, and we begin the time of Amoiroim, of those who contributed ultimately to the Gemara, both the Talmud Bavli and the Talmud Yerushalmi. Now, these two changes, the history of these two changes can be seen, can be understood through the life story of one person who really encapsulated these major changes and was instrumental in making them happen. And this is who we're going to cover this evening. We're going to cover Rav. Rav. You may have heard, again, today you say Rav, you have to say it together with a title, Rav so-and-so. Rav literally translates as rabbi. But who's Rav? Who is Rav simply? So that is Rav. When you learn the Gemara, you open a Gemara, you can't go a few pages before you see Omar Rav. Rav said. Now the reason why he's called Rav, and he doesn't need any titles, he doesn't need any description. This is Rav. This is the Rav. Rav and Rav is just different vowels, same word. He was the man. He was the figure. He was the individual. In those times, the head of the yeshiva, the Rosh Yeshiva, was also the one who was the Rav, what we call today the Rav, the one who meets out halacha. And so you had somebody who was the spiritual leader of, in other words, today you'd have Rosh Yeshiva and a Rav, two positions. In those times, it was one person who filled that position. Also, Rav, as we're going to see, was somebody who was a figure that was very close with the Reish Golusa, which was, and got along very well with the political Jewish leader, and in that sense was able to lead the Jewish people, the Jewish community in Bovel, on a very practical level, hand in hand together with the Reish Golusa in many, many communal matters. Okay, so you have many times people, tzaddikim, who didn't get involved much with communal matters. The other way around, you have people who were leaders, community leaders, people who are what we call oisek b'tzorchei tzibur, engaged with matters of the community, and didn't, day to day weren't busy learning Torah or teaching Torah. Rarely we have an individual who does everything, who is an all-rounder, and is called, what we call in the Jewish vernacular, we call him the Rashke Bahag, the Rosh Kol B'nei HaGoyla, the head of all the diaspora, the head of the Jewish people outside of Eretz Yisrael, Rosh Kol B'nei HaGoyla. And this is a title given to few people, but one of them was Rav. Now, what was his real name? So his real name was actually Abba, Rebbe Abba, and many people today are called Abba as well. And his father was called Aivu, Abba Bar Aivu. He was actually, the Gemara tells us, he was actually physically quite large, quite an imposing figure, and he was born in Bovel. And he descended from the family, at least, of David HaMelech. That made a big difference. We know that in Parshas Vayechi, Yaakov says, Lo Yosur Shevet mi Yehuda, the scepter will not leave Yehuda. Now, that meant literally in the fact that David HaMelech, descended from Shevet Yehuda, would hold the scepter, would be the king, and that he would sort of bequeath that to all of his descendants. But that also meant, more broadly, that Jewish leadership would be in the blood, so to say, of the descendants of Yehuda, particularly of the descendants of David HaMelech. And therefore many, many major Jewish leaders, the Rabbeim, we know, are from Beis David, from the house of David, and this goes back historically. And Rav was from the Beis David, from the house of David. He became a student in Eretz Yisrael. He went up to Eretz Yisrael with his uncle Rabbi Chia, another very famous Tana. Rabbi Chia and his sons were said to be responsible for reviving the entire Torah Shebaal Peh. When they came up from Bovel, they came to Eretz Yisrael to study under Rabbi Yehuda HaNossi. It says when they came, they saved the day. It was the Torah was going to be forgotten. It was really of a dire situation. There had to be an injection of life into the Torah Shebaal Peh, into Jewish learning, into the preservation of Torah Shebaal Peh. Must remember, nothing was officially written yet, and so Rabbi Chia, his sons, and Rav, who is his uncle, came up to Eretz Yisrael, and so Rav became a student of Rabbi Yehuda HaNossi. He also studied under Rabbi Lozer Reb Shimon, the son of Reb Shimon ben Yochai. Rabbi Lozer Reb Shimon, he learned under Rabbi Lozer ben Tzodok, Rabbi Yehuda Reb Yossi, several other very famous Tanoim were the teachers of Rav. The Gemara says that Rav had a hasmoda, a diligence, which was quite unparalleled. He literally did not budge from the Beis HaMedrash, from the house of study. And there's actually a story in the Gemara that he had an argument with another Tana, with another sage called Levi. And Rav argued with Levi, and he told Levi that I'm right and you're wrong, because it was at this time that Rabbi Yehuda HaNossi taught our subject matter. You were missing, you were not around, and you missed it. And I'm telling you that this is what Rabbi Yehuda HaNossi said. And Rav said, because of that, a person should never withhold themselves from being in the Beis HaMedrash, even for 1 hour. Shouldn't move. Maybe there's something that's going to be said that you won't know. Okay, in other words, those days it was literally like that. Torah Sheba'al Peh was literal. You had to sit at the feet, so to say, of the one who embodied the Masorah, the tradition, and not budge, because if you budged, you would miss it, and it would be forgotten. That was really, we have to put ourselves in that mindset. The Rambam writes that Rav was an individual who loisoch sicho betela kol yomov, never spoke idle chatter, never said anything that did not matter, that was not pertinent. He slept very little, the Gemara tells us. Besides for learning the revealed parts of the Torah, we are told that Rav also mastered that which was what we call Kabbalah, Nistar, the hidden parts of the Torah. Rav was, again, the prime student of Talmud of Rabbi Yehuda Hanossi, and was engaged in the Beis Din, in the court of Rabbi Yehuda Hanossi. Now, a very, very interesting sequence of events happened with Rav, and we've in hindsight we can understand the hashgacha protis of these events, although at the time it seemed to cause great frustration to Rav himself. I'm going to introduce you, you may be less familiar with this. There are 3 levels in rabbinic ordination, in being given the ability to be a Rav. Not Rav, the person, but a Rav, a Rav. The 3 levels, 2 of them are active today, 1 is not active today. The first 2, number 1 is called Yoreh Yoreh. Yoreh Yoreh means he may rule. Yoreh. He may rule, Yoreh, he may rule. We say it twice. It's Yoreh Yoreh. He may rule, he may rule. That's number 1. Meaning to say that he may rule a halacha. When somebody, what we call today, gets smicha, smicha has a real meaning, which we just borrow the term today. There was a genuine smicha, which went back all the way to Moshe Rabbeinu. That we've lost today. But when we call today somebody got smicha, what we mean is that they have been given the go-ahead of Yoreh Yoreh. You'll see on a certificate of smicha, that's what you'll see. Yoreh Yoreh. This person has the ability of ruling out a halacha. It doesn't mean they know every halacha. It means that they have the ability of researching and ruling a halacha. That's an important distinction. The next level is what we call Yodin Yodin. Yodin comes from the word din, which is judge. This person may judge cases that come before a dayon. Dayon, din, same root, which is a higher degree, different degree of halachic ability. It is to sit on a beis din and rule of things that come to a dayan, a question of monetary arguments or various other complex questions. Now, in those days, there was a third level of competence, which was called Yatir B'choros Yatir. Yatir B'choros Yatir is that there is such a thing called a B'chor. A B'chor is a firstborn. And we know the Torah tells us that a firstborn animal, kosher animal, is technically a korban, must be brought as a korban. Now that halacha applies even today. Meaning to say there is a kedusha, there's a holiness that is conferred on a bechor, just like a person, similar way, not exactly though. A person, a child, a boy who is a bechor, we know there's a process called pidyon haben, which is a mitzvah. However, when it comes to a bechor behema, a bechor of an animal, there is a certain holiness, a kedusha of a korban, which is conferred on a bechor of an animal, and there are certain prohibitions that one may not have benefit, one may not use this animal because it technically needs to be brought as a korban. Now the trouble is, in the time that you don't have a Beis HaMikdash, what do you do? So there's various ways of how we deal with this. today is actually, if you look in the Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, there is a process, just like we sell the chometz today, there is a process of selling prior to the birth of the bechor. There's a process where a Jewish farmer would sells a portion, a share in the bechor, in this firstborn animal, to a goy, to a non-Jew, and because the halacha is that an animal which belongs to jointly to both a Jew and a non-Jew is exempt from a bechor. So to get around the issue of having a bechor belonging to a yid, we do a sale in that way. Well, sometimes that doesn't go in Eretz Yisrael. They do, there are people that don't do this. Anyway, it's a big deal. But one of the ways in where we have the ability of a bechor, of an animal, becoming exempt from the kedusha, from the holiness, from the din of being this bechor and becoming sort of a regular animal, is if it gets a mum, if it gets a blemish. We know that the Torah says a animal that has a blemish is disqualified from being brought as a korban in the Beis Hamikdash. So, if the animal gets a blemish, so then it goes out of having that kedusha. The question is, what is a blemish, and what that is a big deal. How do you tell if the mum on an animal is a genuine mum? And, whether the mum will be healed or it will not be healed, whether, if the mum will be healed, then it can return to its original state of kedusha. So you have to know anatomy, you have to know animals very well. Now, the Gemara says that Rav actually was qualified in all three of these levels of ruling halacha. But Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi gave him only two of them. He gave him the Yodin, but did not confer on him Yatir B'choris Yatir. Did not confer on him this final ability of allowing the B'choris. Yatir B'choris, he can allow a B'chor Yatir, he can allow it. He can allow it to become not a B'chor anymore. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who we call Rabbi, did not give him this allowance. It's unclear, the Gemara is not clear as to why this was the case. The Gemara has several suggestions as to why Rabbi did this or didn't do this, but the Gemara isn't clear. Rav, it seems, was quite competent. He said he spent months and months living on a farm to learn animals, to learn whatever, sheep, goats, whatever it was, and to learn blemishes, to learn which kind of blemish is genuinely a mum, halachically a mum, which blemishes will be healed, not be healed, all these things. He was quite competent, but Rebbe didn't want to give him that final go-ahead. The Gemara has a suggestion. The Gemara says that Rebbe thought it wasn't necessary. The Rebbe thought he didn't have to give him that title, so to say, because he had inherent greatness that Rebbe didn't think he had to, kind of give him that certificate kind of thing. He was beyond that. Regardless of, but it's unclear. There wasn't a clear understanding. Regardless of that, Rav felt that he wasn't going to be complete. He wasn't going to fulfill himself, so to say, be able to function completely in Eretz Yisrael, and so he decided to go back to his home country where he was born, Bavel. He went to Bavel, but things didn't work out. It didn't. It's often when you have somebody with tremendous capabilities, but doesn't have the setting, doesn't have the people or the community in which they can properly fulfill their great capabilities. That seemed to be the situation with Rav. Rav went back to Eretz Yisrael. This is already after the passing of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. Rav studied with Rabbi Gamliel Berebi, Rabbi Gamliel, the son of Rabbi Yehuda Hanossi. Again, but it was the son of Rabbi Yehuda Hanossi who took over Rabbi Yehuda Hanossi, and it wasn't going to be him, although he was seen as the ultimate Talmid, the student of Rabbi Yehuda Hanossi. The son of Rabbi Yehuda Hanossi said he couldn't give him a title, the Yater Becheres Yater. His father hadn't given it to him, so he couldn't find it within himself to give it to him. Anyway, around the year 219 of the Common Era, Rav returns to Bovel. Now, before we describe his life in Bovel, we want to know, what did Rav do on a daily basis, aside for learning how did he live? Well, the Gemara says that in various sources he had businesses in Eretz Yisroel. He sold silk, he sold linen, and he had also fields. Agriculture was his thing. Whether he did it himself or hired other people to do it, I'm not sure if we know exactly, but he had fields. That's how he kept himself living. Very interesting. The Gemara tells us that Rav had a difficult marriage. His wife was not kind to him. The Gemara actually describes it that it was that way round. She describes various things that she did, which made his life quite miserable. And we're going to see how many of the teachings of Rav later on seem to have reflected that, as many institutions that Rav made that in Jewish marriage that seem to reflect his own life. But we'll get to that soon. Anyway, he goes back to Bovel. Second time, Rav goes back to Bovel. And in the beginning, he doesn't find himself fully. He becomes, in the beginning, the Meturgamon for Rav Shila. Rav Shila was the Rosh Yeshiva. A Meturgamon. What's a Meturgamon? A Meturgamon, literally, it comes from the word Targum, which means to translate. Now, in those days, what happened was that the Rosh Yeshiva would teach, but he would sit and he would say what he had to say, and he would, it would be in a sort of, he would just speak. He wouldn't make, what wasn't considered, I guess, the thing that he should make the effort to speak in a way that, as an orator would speak for everybody. No, he was the terror person, and he would just say, and then he had the Meturgamon. He had somebody on the side who would say it over, and would explain it, would sort of say it in a nice way, in a built-up fashion, say it out to the public. Now, so Rav became the Meturgamon for Rav Shila. The trouble is that Rav often disagreed with Rav Shila and would put in his own thing. So that didn't work out very well, and so he had to move on from that. Didn't work. He had to move on from there. The Reish Golusa, the head of the political leader of the community then in Bovel, appointed Rav as an inspector for the shops, for the various stores. That didn't work out too well either. Rav felt there were certain things that the Reish Golusa did or didn't do in the laws of business. And he ended up in jail. The Reish Galusa locked him up, and Rav Shila got him out. It was sort of a situation that wasn't working out too well. It came to the point when Rav Shila passed away. This is Rav Shila, the Rosh Yeshiva in Bovel, and it was assumed by many that Rav was the next in line. Rav was the one to become Rosh Yeshiva. However, Rav demurred. Rav stepped back. He would not become the Rosh Yeshiva because there was a individual who was always there, who was sort of a stationary, was a resident there his entire life, it seems, and that is Shmuel. Shmuel. In the Gemara we find, who knows how many times, Rav u'Shmuel. We find discussions and arguments between Rav and Shmuel, his colleague. Shmuel became the Rosh Yeshiva instead of Rav Shila, and that meant that Rav had to look for somewhere else to become Rav. Rav went to a city called Sura. Sura was a community, a very a sort of a nice community in the sense that it was very established, very many Jewish people, but many or most of them were Amei Ha'oretz, were terribly ignorant. And the Gemara describes of how ignorant is ignorant. That Rav overheard once a conversation between two ladies, and one lady asked the other, "Do you know how much milk do you need in order to cook a measurement of meat? You know, how much milk do you got to put into the pot in order for the meat to come out good?" Now, apparently, this was just ignorance. It wasn't like they was doing this purposefully. They just didn't know. They just didn't know that this was a problem. They were Jews. Again, go back to our analogy with America. When you had, this is a perfect description of, if any of you had, I don't know how many of you, how many generations you are American, if you are American, that is. But many other countries, England, where I'm from, is very much the same thing. Going back 2, 3 generations, 4 generations, our great-grandparents, grandparents, they came from Russia or whatever it was. They came off the boat, and whether them or their children, especially the children, if they didn't attend a yeshiva, didn't attend a day school, it was just, they were good people, good Jews, just very thoroughly ignorant. And this is where Rav showed up. Again, the history is very, very similar, uncannily similar in an uncanny way. The Gemara says, Rav Biko Motzo V'Godar Bo Geder. Rav found a open valley, a breached space, a place that was not fenced in. People were sort of drifting off, and he fenced it in. He made a fence, he made a wall around it. Rav created a yeshiva in Sura. How do you make a yeshiva? Well, this is the story of many yeshivas in some way, shape or form. Where there's a will, there's a way, they say. And it was a will. It was a certain ger tzedek, a certain ger, a convert, who left, didn't have children, and left Rav a large house of his, which Rav took over, and that became the yeshiva in Sura. The yeshiva in Sura lasted for the better part of 800 years. 800 years. This runs through the time of the Gemara with the generations and generations of Gaonim, of the great Gaonim that led the Jewish community in Bovel from a spiritual perspective. And in the time of Rav, this yeshiva grew from this one-house yeshiva to a yeshiva of 1,200 talmidim, 1,200 students. Shmuel, now Rav Shila and Shmuel, they were in a place called Nahar Do'o, another city, another town, city probably, Nahar Do'o, and so you had Sura and Nahar Do'o. There were other yeshivas in Bovel, the famous Pumbedisa. Pumbedisa was another yeshiva. Mechuzah, we'll maybe get to that in a different lesson. Mechuzah was a great center of Torah later on. So these are famous names for the great yeshivas that were in Bovel. Now Rav was, again, he was the Rosh Kol Bnei Hagoyla, the head of the entire exile. He was thick in to the situation of the community, of the people. He was the everything. What he instituted was, he saw the ignorance, he saw the need for Torah learning, and he instituted something which lasts in effect till today in various ways, something we call Yarchei Kalo. Yarchei Kalo literally means Yarchei, the months, Kalo of the bride. And what that meant is that this was 2 months a year, the month of Elul and the month of Adar, meaning the month before Tishrei and the month before Pesach. And these were the 2 months where people would take off from work, people would go on holiday, vacation, and they would go to the yeshiva, and there would be major shiurim, major teaching, and not just that, but also a convention of Talmidei Chachamim, of the Amoraim of the time, and this was many things were hammered out, were figured out, were discussed during the Kala, during these 2 months of the Kala of the bride. It was like a chasna, it was like a wedding, it was the convention, it was a joyous time, it was a very elevated time, and this was Rav's institution. Now, the foundations for the Talmud Bavli were laid down by Rav. Rav was the perfect individual. There could not have been somebody who was more apt than Rav to do this. Rav had been the Talmud, the prime student of Rabbi Yehuda Anossi, the editor of the Mishnah, had been in Eretz Yisroel with his uncle Reb Chia, with the greatest Tanoim, the contributors to the Mishnah of the time, and had absorbed all of that, then gone to Bovel, studied and learnt in the yeshiva in Ardo with Rav Shila, and was contemporaries with the generation, after the Tanoim, with the Amoraim, got everything from there. He's the man who had all that, had absorbed all that there was to know, and then laid down the foundations for the future, for the discussion around the Mishnah, which eventually became the Gemara. There are literally hundreds of arguments listed in the Gemara between Rav and Shmuel. Rav was the person who had come from Eretz Yisrael. Shmuel had the tradition of Bovel, so there was going to be not always, but hundreds of times, a clash between Rav and Shmuel in various things. There's rules actually of when the halacha is like Rav, when the halacha is like Shmuel. Gets very interesting. Now, what's very unique, however, about Rav is that Rav had a thing about him, a title to him, which said, Rav Tanohu Upolig. Rav can be considered a Tana, a contributor to the Mishnah, Upolig, and therefore can argue with another Tana. The convention is that Rabbi Yehuda Hanossi had sealed the Mishnah. Everything that was available had gone into the Mishnah, and all the arguments that could be conceived of were put into the Mishnah, and then that was it. You can't argue with a Tana. You could comment on a Tana, you can rule like one Tana or another Tana, but you can't go, an Amora, somebody who's contributing to the Gemara, couldn't go and say, Rabbi Yehuda or Rabbi Yossi said this and I argue. It didn't work like that. It doesn't work like that. However, Rav was an exception. Rav was among those Tanoim. He was a Talmud of Rabbi Yehuda Anossi. He was a contemporary of many of them. He was a bridge over from the time of the Mishnah to the time of the Gemara, but retained the authority of a Tana, of somebody who had contributed to the Mishnah. The Talmidim of Rav are numerous. He had Talmidim like nobody else, it seems. Literally the entire gamut of the next generation of Amoraim, the people who created the Talmud Bavli, whose names are all over. So Rav Yehuda, Rav Huna, Rav Chista, Rav Gidel, Rav Asi, Rav Hamnuna, Rav Kahana, and the list goes on and on. Somebody did this, I don't know if it was via computer or somebody who actually knew the whole Shas. Somebody did this and recorded the fact that there are 167 Amoraim in the Gemara who say something in the name of Rav. 167. Meaning, and this you find many times in the Gemara. Omer Rav so-and-so said, in the name of Rav so-and-so, in the name of Rav. And sometimes it could be like 4 or 5. Omer Rav so-and-so, in the name of Rav so-and-so, in the name of Rav so-and-so, in the name of Rav. and it all comes back to Rav. There's nobody after Rav. That's the rule. Where it says, Omer Rav this, Omer Rav that, Omer Rav, in the name of Rav. Oh, Rav said it. It comes back to Rav. And that's the best place you're going to get, because if it came from Rav, that meant it came from the ultimate source of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, possibly available at the time. Rav, who studied with Rabbi Yehuda Hanossi, the link to the Mishnah. Now, it was very interesting, historically speaking. Shmuel was very well positioned with the Babylonian government. He was had his connections in the government. We have many stories of Shmuel with non-Jewish aristocrats, various stories with Avleit, Stargazer. Shmuel was very good with the general population. Rav kept local. Rav was extremely active within the Jewish community. He was very close and had good working relations with the Reish Golusa. That was actually not always the case. Not always did the spiritual leader, the Rosh Yeshiva, get along with the Reish Golusa. Many times they clashed, and it got interesting, shall we say. However, Rav was an exception to that. Rav actually made a shidduch with the Reish Golusa. Rav's child, I forget if it was son or daughter, married the son or daughter of the Reish Golusa. That helped as well. We have several tefillos, several parts of the davening which were composed by Rav. The most significant one, it seems, is the brachos in the Musaf of Rosh Hashanah. We know Rosh Hashanah, Musaf is a special Musaf, unique to the entire year, whereby we have an obligation on Rosh Hashanah to say Pesukim, verses of Malchios, of Hashem's kingship, Hashem's sovereignty, Zichronos, of Hashem's remembering everything, remembering the entire creation, and Shofros, Pesukim that mention the shofar blowing. Now we have this obligation of saying these Pesukim. However, we know that the Musaf, we have 3 brachos, 3 blessings, and we have tefillos, we have prayers, davening, that go along with these Pesukim, both before and after. So we start the Malchios with Oleinu L'Shabeach, where we bow in Rosh Hashanah, right? And we go for Al Kain, that's the official beginning to Malchios. Then we end it with the whole Elokeinu v'Elokeinu Zochreinu b'Zikaron Tov L'Fonecha. So it ends with a tefillah. Those tefillos, those parts of the davening, not the psukim themselves, but the davening around them on the Musaf of Rosh Hashanah, was composed by Rav. Another part of the davening is Vatoy Dienu. Vatoy Dienu is the Havdalah that we say in Shemona Esra when a Yom Tov goes into a Shabbos. Sorry, when a Shabbos goes into a Yom Tov, I apologize. In other words, when you have a Shabbos, and then the Shabbos, Motzoi Shabbos, is Yom Tov, then we say in the Ma'ariv, we say Vatoy Dienu, similar to Atochenan Tonu, that we say Motzoi Shabbos, in the Ma'ariv, the Havdalah in the Shemona Esrei. There's Vatoy Dienu that we say on Motzoi Shabbos that goes into Yom Tov, a very beautiful piece of davening. It's very unique. Some things that we say there. Anyway, that was composed by Rav. Now, again, from the Torah of Rav, we can, now that we know the story, the life of Rav a little bit, so some of the words of Rav, some of the things that he said and he did, can be readily understood and appreciated. So, for example, the very famous dictum that tells us, L'olam yasek odom b'Torah shaloi lishma. A person should learn Torah always, even for the wrong reasons, even not for its own sake. A person should always learn shemitoich shaloi lishma b'al lishma, because from learning the Torah, maybe not for the right, with the right drive, a person will come to learning it for the right reasons. Right? The Torah, it says, has a kedusha, the holiness of the Torah, will bring the person back ultimately. So again, as you could see, Rav was trying to bring the people into learning Torah. So he said to them, "Come and learn. Don't worry. We'll give you, you make a nice kiddush, you make a nice spread, you put on a show, all the gimmicks and the tricks to get people to come and learn. But the main thing is they come and learn. Once they're learning, then they're already learning, and they're in the good place." That's from Rav. Rav also said, again, we can understand this, we can appreciate this from the life that Rav led. Rav said that a person who is a Jewish leader, who is a spiritual leader, has to be very cautious when it comes to Chilul Hashem, when it comes to doing something that can be construed as something wrong by the public. And Rav said, Heichidomi, what can we say, what is a Chilul Hashem? And he says that if I, meaning him, Rav, go into a butcher and I take meat and I don't pay for it. Now, usually this could be, people would say, he has credit, whatever it is, he doesn't pay for it. Maybe the butcher's just being nice to him. But if Rav did that and people would see that, that would be construed as something people would start talking about it. What do you mean? He just took meat and he walked out? What kind of thing is that? That's how careful a sage, a Rav, has to be, a great person has to be when going about his business affairs in public, never to do something that can even be construed, can even be misunderstood as something wrong. Rav was a tzaddik, again, which the Gemara has many, many beautiful things that Rav did and shows of his greatness. It says Rav, although being quite tall and imposing, never went upright. He never walked in the street, with his full posture. He always walked a little subdued, in a way of humility. He would go into the Beis HaMedrash quickly, so he would just kind of be found there, and people wouldn't have the time to stand up for him and make the whole ceremony. Many times you have a great person walks into the room, oh, right, it's now everybody stands, and you have a whole, fuss around this great person. However, Rav didn't want that. He used to walk in quickly, and people, he's here. And he didn't have time to give him honor that way. If he had wronged anybody, again, a person who's involved in communal affairs, that's inevitable. The only way to, the Rebbe once said, the only way to make sure that you don't offend anybody is if you don't do anything. If you do things, if you are communally active, then not everybody is going to be 100% always pleased with you and happy with you, and you may wrong somebody, or rather maybe they would think that you wronged them. Rav, if any of that happened, Rav, this is the ultimate, the Rosh Hashiva, the Rav, the Tzaddik, the everything. He would go over to the person and ask them for forgiveness, for mechila. He would not wait for that person to come to him. He would make the overture and go to them. Now, some of the institutions of Rav, as mentioned before, may have reflected his own life. But these are important institutions. We cannot underestimate them, although we may think of it as something obvious, but we must not underestimate how important it was all those centuries ago. So number one, Rav instituted that a person is forbidden to be makadesh, to marry a woman without first seeing her. Now, to us that seems a little more than obvious. A person has to see, a man has to see their wife and vice versa. Well, in some places in the world you may know that that's not obvious, even until today. But in the ancient world, that was not a given necessarily. Rav made that a obligation. He banned marriage without first seeing, even in other words, the most basic element of getting to know one's wife. The other ban was that Rav forbade a person, a man, a father, marrying off his daughter while she was still a minor. She was still a ketano. And in other words, that this was the case, that a person was able to do this, that as a minor, he was able to marry off his daughter. Rav banned it. Now again, was this Rav's own experience? We don't know. But we do know that Rav had a difficult marriage, and this was something that these were institutions that may, again, we don't know exactly, but may have come forth from Rav's own experience. Rav said, this is another famous thing, that a man must be very careful in how he speaks to his wife, because women have more emotionally fragile, will more easily cry than a man, and therefore a man particularly has to take greater care in how he speaks to his wife. Okay, so these were things that this is actually quite reminiscent of certain institutions that were made much later by Rabbeinu Gershom Me'or HaGoyla. You may be familiar. This is this is already in the Middle Ages. Another Rosh Kobonei HaGoyla, a head of the exile, Rabbeinu Gershom. They made various bans, various charomos on various things. But again, these are things were far from given in those days, and this came from Rav. So to end off, the Gemara tells us that Rav was the undisputed leader of the entire exile, the Rosh Kobonei HaGoyla, chutz mishmuel, besides for Shmuel. Shmuel was a contemporary of Rav. But there is always in every time, in every time in history, in especially times of transition, that we have the individual, the man, so to say, or the woman, but the man who made all the difference, who embodied and enabled the Teresh Baal Peh, the Mishnah, to come over to Bovel. Ultimately, after various trials and tribulations, it was Rav, undisputedly, who embodied the Teresh Baal Peh, taught the Teresh Baal Peh, taught everything that there was to teach to the next generation of Amoraim, who, because of them, we today have the Talmud Bavli, we have the Gemara, and we have the Halacha as we know it today. This will end the lesson for this evening, and next week, Mitzvah Shem, we will get to the next generation, the next pillar in the creation of the Gemara. And meanwhile, have a wonderful Chodesh and a Kabbalas HaTorah B'Simcha V'Pnimius, a wonderful Yom Tov of Shavuos.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Hope it came through clearly. Is that all right? Yeah? Okay. Great.
Yeah, it was perfect. Thank you.
Lovely. Have a good night.
you.